In 1864, the first International Working Men's Association meeting is held in London. It's supposed to be international, and they're short of Germans, so the organizers reach out to the German section of town and invite a disgruntled journalist that is generally regarded as kind of grubby. For better or worse, that was a fateful choice, and Karl Marx's rise from obscurity to being the leading voice of a movement that would take over Russia and China began. In 1852, one of France's most prominent authors, Victor Hugo, had run afoul of Napoleon III and been exiled to an island off the coast of France. He'd already published a treatise attacking the tyrant Napoleon, unfavorably comparing him to his great uncle, but his literary career was otherwise on hold as events in France were still treacherous, both for Hugo personally and for democracy in general. Waiting for his new direction, Hugo held and transcribed an incredible 2 years' worth of seances, where the transcripts would reveal conversations with Shakespeare, Jesus, and both of the Napoleons. The seances would end on the same night that one of the attendees, when Jules Ali, Allix, would collapse into a catatonic coma, completely insane at the start of one of the sessions. But not before one of the voices from beyond the grave told Hugo finished the manuscript for Les Miserables. Incredibly, the fates of all three men would come together in 1871 at the Paris Commune, where for 3 months radical workers defied the national government and sought to govern Paris. Jules Allix would be revealed for the madman that he was. Karl Marx responded to the Commune in writing and was launched into an internationally recognized figure, and Victor Hugo would have his house stormed by rioters who opposed his calls for leniency when the Commune collapsed in 1871. What a crazy intersection of fates for Marx and Hugo, two of the world's most prominent authors on the subject of poverty. The legacy of Marx and his influence on poverty and the poor is complicated at best. Hugo's is more straightforward and presses the question, is it hypocritical to become fabulously wealthy writing about the plight of the poor? Hugo wasn't the only one to get rich on this story, and the producers of the musical now rank among the wealthiest people anywhere and are dogged by the same questions as Hugo. Has time and the writing of Marx changed the answer? And why is France the only place the musical has flopped? Are the answers to these two questions related? We'll sort it all out in this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. Just a few quick notes before we get going. The footnotes are in the transcripts. Earlier on, I'd been putting in the show notes, but they actually exceed the length requirements there, so they have been moved. I will just say today's episode is going to be a little more philosophical. It's going to be a little bit less about the details and the crazy connections, but it is going to dive into some of the economic analyses that other authors have put out there. I find it interesting. I hope you do too. Just be aware it's going to be slightly different from the rest of what we're doing. And this is the last episode of Les Mis. It's our 14th episode overall. It's like we're finishing a season. Thank you. Thank you for your support. And there are 3 things that I will ask you to do. If you could post this on social media and share it with others, that will make a difference. If you could make sure that you are following this on your player of choice, that would be great. And if you could subscribe to $3 an episode, that is also would be helpful. I want your attention and your ears far more than your money. But if $6 a month is in your budget and you can support research-driven content that looks at the less explored parts of history and musicals, please don't hold back. But most of all, let me know that you're out there. I am happy screaming into the void, but it's way more fun to hear an echo back. And you can do that by dropping a rating, sending me a message, clicking the follow button. And if you can send some money, that's great. But more than anything, I appreciate your support for the show, and keeping this as part of what you listen to makes me happier than you can imagine. Today, we're going to explore 2 and only 2 topics: the relationship of theater to poverty, and then we will ask why Les Mis works everywhere but France, and then try to sew those 2 topics together. All right, poverty. First things first. Les Mis, the novel, was a huge financial success. As we have learned in previous episodes, it was the first international blockbuster. There had been other books that had gone global, but this was the first one that was marketed and simultaneously released in a bunch of cities and in different languages. It sold out immediately. Hugo had offers for 150,000 francs for the right to the book, but he held out for 300,000 and he got it. And it was worth it. A publishing entrepreneur named Albert Lacroix had paid the huge sum, but made back all of his money and made tons of profits. That was then followed by successful stage plays, including one by his son Charles that ran in the 1890s. And then it became one of the first big smash hit movies of all time in the silent film era. But it was not reviewed well at all, for reasons that seem a little absurd. Flaubert did not like it because he called it Catholico-socialist poop, but with a stronger word for poop. And that was weird because it was definitely not Catholic. And a key clue that the conclusion is not Catholic is that the Catholic Church banned it. As Kathy Grossman of Penn State put it in her 1986 book, the critic said he was paid by the page and, quote, the tears he shed over the wretched of the world were, they said, paid most dearly, end quote. The actual value of that claim, I'm dubious about. I haven't seen anything that said he was paid by the page. Might have been, and I just missed it. But a bunch of critics thought he was excusing criminal activity or removing individual responsibility for it, but also that he was, crying tears for the wretched world while making money off of it. For his wealth and his love life, Hugo had an elaborate system of thought that justified his behavior. His love life was more than a little fraught. He bemoaned the society that forced women into prostitution, but he visited many prostitutes himself. And I will not dwell on it here because I've talked about this before, but he definitely had a way where he could think of all his numerous affairs were okay, or, one-time flings, one-night stands, but they were definitely not as risk-free for the women that he was with as they were for him. And he did come up with a way of justifying that to himself. I'm not sure that looking back over his shoulder, most of us would agree with him. The money side, where he was getting rich by writing about poverty, is a little easier to square. He thought, and I believe he's correct about this, that the real issue was that society was actively keeping the very poor as very poor, and that an author getting paid for their work wasn't really linked to that in any direct way. But a fairly conclusive point in my mind is how he was embraced at his funeral. We covered this in a prior episode, but the Cliff Notes version is that his funeral drew more people than the population of Paris. And socialist writer Megan Berendt said the proceedings were, quote, a festival of the oppressed, unquote. My experience has also been that poor people can generally spot a hypocrite pretty easily. I have mentioned that I've done some research by interviewing people who are not housed. Boy, are they good at identifying the people who say that they're showing up to help them when really they're advancing their own agenda, not helping the poor. And it was evident that Hugo had won the hearts and the minds of the poor. If he made money on the book, he spent a very politically active career advocating on their behalf, in the words of Berendt, quote, giving voice to the voiceless, end quote. In the earlier episodes, we talked about what a politically involved life Victor Hugo led, and at all points, he was advocating on the behalf of the dispossessed. So I think Victor Hugo, there's a question about whether or not it's okay for him to make money while talking about the poor, but the rest of his life makes it abundantly clear that that was a core issue for him, and he was very serious about it. It wasn't just a money-making operation for him. That might not settle the question, but it's definitely a point in his favor. The musical is a little less straightforward. Outside of Les Mis, some of the most successful people, including Andrew Lloyd Webber, fall on the, quote, crime is a failure of individual responsibility, end quote, side of the equation, which was the same group to savage Hugo's work initially. Inside of Les Mis, Cameron McIntosh, who made more money than anyone else on the production, has detractors, although he did tell Trump to stop playing Les Mis in the Songstress rallies. Both may be decent guys, but neither really has the political chops that Victor Hugo had as a nonstop advocate for the poor. In fact, if anything, they were more of the hard-on crime side. So if there's a case to be made about it being a little greasy to make huge piles of money while writing shows about sympathy for the poor, it's more squarely leveled against the musical. All right, so speaking in broad political terms, if you were to imagine a line and on the opposite sides were different opinions about the causes of crime, on one side you'd see the law and order folks who see crime as a huge failure of personal morality. Crime is committed by criminals. Criminals are bad people, and the political responses stem from there. It's usually a crackdown and harsher penalties. At the other side of that line, the other end of the spectrum, you would find Victor Hugo saying as loudly as possible that crime is a product of society and the law, putting the poor and disenfranchised into horrible situations and over punishing them for minor offenses that tend to compound over time. In one view, it would be fine to throw Fantine in jail for prostitution because she is a prostitute and that is a failure and her fault. On the other side, she deserves compassion and rehabilitation. In other words, the two poles are defined by Javert, who judges everyone harshly, and Jean Valjean, who judges them not at all. Hugo is definitely advocating Jean Valjean as the correct approach and Javert as the problem, but there's plenty of law and order people, including probably Mackintosh and Weber, who tend to fall on the side of we need harsher penalties are the correct response to crime. Jenny Hughes, who I'll properly introduce in a second, points out the irony of the very wealthy theatergoers having to navigate past unhoused people who were growing in numbers just as the show was getting popular. And Mackintosh has openly complained about crime growing in the West End, while his own show has a very concrete and unmistakable solution for that situation. Just ask yourself, what would Jean Valjean do? Would Jean Valjean say, we need to put more police and clean up the streets there? Or would Jean Valjean say, let's find those poor people, let us treat them with compassion and give them money, let's say silver candlesticks, and see if that can transform their lives? That, at any rate, it is a special irony that during the time Les Mis was being released, the housing issue in London was getting more acute, and that wealthy theater patrons were actually having to very directly encounter unhoused people on their way to see a show about being compassionate to unhoused people. As a side note, there are many who are not troubled by this situation. Sternfeld recounts the story of a Washington, D.C. production that invited 150 unhoused people to attend the show. And the reviews of those unhoused people were generally positive. And this she takes to be a fairly firm defeat to the objection that the show allows rich people to gaze at poverty and feel good about themselves. So for Sternfeld, it's not a problem that the show is about poverty, but people are making a lot of money by talking about being compassionate about toward the poor. Now pause here and say that these are the very straightforward criticisms of the situation. The conclusion is it is hypocritical to champion the needs of the poor while making piles of money on your production. I'm not going to answer that question because I think there's a bigger question and one that Hugo's book puts front and center. And the question is, what can be done to address the needs of the poor? If big musical productions help us make progress on that question, they are probably worthwhile. If they make it worse, they probably are not worthwhile. And if you're satisfied that the production has done more than most to engage in charity and give back to the community, then you're probably okay with the show. And Sternfeld notes that that is true of the Les Mis production. It has engaged in more charity and put more back into the community than your average Broadway mega show does. So for Sternfeld, that is enough. For people I'm about to talk about, it definitely is not enough, but I'm just marking this moment to say that's just kind of a armchair and very quick reaction to it. Is the show hypocritical? Sternfeld says no because they get involved. Others say yes. Let's leave that there and see if we can do a deeper dive and get to a more powerful understanding. There are those who would probe deeper, and here I will introduce you to the star of this show, Jenny Hughes of the University of Manchester, who's writing in the publication Theatre Journal in 2015. I will present some core ideas from that piece and let you know where I'm departing from Hughes's ideas to share my own. Hughes is in that piece comparing Les Mis to another production that's called Road, but I'm just going to focus on Les Mis half. And Hughes starts with a huge section that is a critical take on economics. And, not to give you an entire lecture on high theory, but basically the traditional study of economics is just how do we maximize profit? What are the inputs and outputs? What stocks should I invest in? The critical take on economics is to take more of a Karl Marx step back and just say, what is an economy? Who does it help? Who does it hurt? How does it shape society? And Marx was writing over 150 years ago. So just imagine 150 years of very smart people to continue to chew on that question. Hughes takes all that on in this first section of the article. It includes a discussion of Marx, of Freud, of David Harvey, who writes extensively on a concept called neoliberalism, of Jacques Rancière, who I have not heard before this article, but is indeed a critical economist, of Michel Foucault, who's sort of a champion of post-structuralism, of Dominique Laporte, who wrote a book that was titled A History of Shit, that was published by the MIT Press, and a few others. I'm not going to review all of that, although I think Hughes does a nice job, and I've got the footnote there if you want to look it up. But for our purposes, I just want to focus on this concept called neoliberalism. Here is an extended quote from Hughes. I'm going to read it all and then we'll unpack it. Quote, "Useful here is David Harvey's definition of neoliberalism, as founded on the rhetoric that, quote, human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills with an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade." That ends the Harvey quote within Hughes quote. The Hughes quote continues, "Viewed by the political left as an economic ideology that exacerbates inequality, and by the right as generating wealth in ways that benefit many, neoliberalism, as articulated in the writings of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, for example, conceptualizes poverty as a condition that, while unfortunate, is a necessary stimulant to general prosperity. Harvey, from the political left, agrees that wealth and poverty are mutually interdependent, with neoliberal economic regimes drawing attention to neoliberalism's distinct contribution to the long-term capitalist project of accumulation by dispossession," end quote. All right, let's take a minute to unpack all that. Neoliberalism is a catch-all term that emphasizes the free market as the key to unlocking human potential. But the political left feels that in doing so, it locks poverty in as a permanent part of society. Why is that exactly? Well, they'll start by saying that as an empirical fact, neoliberalism, which we've been pursuing for the last half century, maybe a little longer, has worked very well for the elites, but not at all well for the poor. Commonplace statement is that the rich-poor inequality now is higher than it was during the French Revolution, and the salaries of executives are undoubtedly soaring way out of proportion to that of the wage workers. This is happening fairly recently, and those who get buried in debt are finding it harder and harder to get out. We've had a couple, for example, the housing crisis, the recession of 2007 was because a bunch of real estate brokers were making piles of money by foisting a whole bunch of debt on people who were buying houses that they really couldn't afford. And what eventually happened was that entire ticket, the cost of all that was borne by the public, and it was paid for by the people who would lose their house. Okay, so the promise of capitalism is that if you work hard enough, you can rise from a floor worker to a chief executive, and that is true, but it also means that while that is possible for anyone, it can't happen for everyone, or even for very many. For everyone who believed in themselves, stuck with it, took the 1 in a million shot, and came out on top, the vast majority do not. I mean, isn't that the plot for just about every musical ever, from Annie to Newsies? But for every 1,000,000 to 1 shot that makes it, there are 99,999 who don't. But the constant belief that it's possible to succeed within this framework keeps attention away from what's happening to most people. And worst of all, it allows us to blame the poorest among us for their situation. If the economic system didn't work for you, but it did work for Elon Musk, there must be something wrong with you, and Elon Musk must be a genius because he figured it out. And if that whole critique sounds very Victor Hugo to you, I do not think you are off base. I see it too. So the system works so that an individual investor puts up the capital and takes the risk. If that risk loses money, they go bankrupt, they're in hot water, although usually there's protections for the uber wealthy. And when it hits, like it did for Apple and for Microsoft and for Facebook and for Google, those who invested the capital get fabulously wealthy, and everyone else just gets what might be a fair wage for the specific work they did. The way it's structured, there will always be an extremely wealthy group of people who are running the biggest corporations, a middle class that makes a decent living if they're lucky enough to get one of the good jobs at the companies of the very wealthy, and a bunch of really poor people who end up buying smartphones and computer chips that the super wealthy are producing or spending their time on Facebook generating advertising dollars for the big tech giants. Okay, and what I just said is part Hughes, it is part David Harvey, it is part John Brushke, that's me, but I do think it's a reasonably accurate description of neoliberalism and why people are concerned with it. Now, within that framework, charity is not an issue. If the richest people make billions from a system that guarantees that millions of people have to stay poor to make it happen, having those billionaires throw the scraps off their table to charities won't really change things. There is a much deeper discussion of that in other places. I'm not going to get into all of that right now. But if you believe in neoliberalism, you usually don't think that having the wealthiest people contribute some money to charities is a meaningful gesture. It's not something that's going to transform the world. Now, I'm not an absolutist. I'm not as absolutist as your average neoliberal critic, and I've seen many charities and nonprofits that really do important work and really do change lives. But I do think there's a valid point, the belief that you have to look at the way the economy is structured in addition to having all those charities and nonprofits do their thing. If we are serious about eliminating poverty, I don't think that the charity structures that we have now are going to be able to do it by themselves. Hughes explicitly lists how this belief system played out under the Reagan-Thatcher era. Public subsidies were thought of as investments that sought returns, and the theater getting public funding wasn't just expected to make a cultural contribution and raise intellectual enrichment of the audience. It was supposed to form a public-private partnership and make a profit. The winners in this system were people like Trevor Nunn, who could get some serious theater networking done for the publicly subsidized Royal Shakespeare Company, and then split his time with Katz and make a fortune. And the losers were the independent, the regional, the experimental, and generally the left-wing theaters. Hughes' point is that Les Mis participates quite a bit in this neoliberal framework, and really it does. The actors, especially in the West End, were paid less than the average wage that workers would make in the city. All theater asks workers to subsidize their own development, pay for their own acting classes, get themselves ready for the production and whatnot, especially if you've ever been involved in regional or community theater. They're also expected to get people to show up and buy tickets, get them to show up and watch them. None of those are expenses that are borne by the people that will get the money back. They then sell their labor at fixed rates. So you become a fantastic actor or a good singer or a good musician, and you sell what you're doing for a fixed rate. If the show hits it big, then the producers will make the big money, but the actors will still have to negotiate a series of fixed contracts. You can get better or worse deals, but you'll never make the kind of money that the producers are. And even in this high-skilled area, the workers are treated as interchangeable factory workers. On Les Mis in particular, to keep it fresh, the actors were literally replaced with other people. The thought was that the person who's really got the creative force, the person who should really benefit, is whoever the CEO is, the person who risked the initial capital, and that they should benefit phenomenally no matter how big those profits are. They should always get the majority of them, and no matter how much those profits work depend on the people who are working on the show, those people can always be replaced. So in the end, the neoliberal formula had perfectly played out in these productions. By the end, Mackintosh was one of the wealthiest people in England. Those lucky enough to get the good jobs in the production did pretty well. And all the actors who weren't in the cast, of course, didn't get anything if you tried out for the show and you didn't get into it. And so that is kind of the perfect description of what happens in sort of the Google-dominated economic era. The people who are at the top of Google make a ton of money. The people who are lucky enough to get the good jobs at Google make some money, and everybody who can't get a job at Google is completely left out. If you were just to superimpose that structure on Les Mis, the producers make a pile of money. If you were good enough to get one of the better paying jobs on the production, then it worked for you. But if you were one of the thousands of actors or hundreds of actors who auditioned or wanted to be in the show and just can't get in, then you get exactly nothing. As the trickle-down policies of Reagan and Thatcher increasingly failed to trickle down and the number of the poor multiplied, and that happened everywhere, but especially around the theaters in West End and Broadway. So the first thing that Hughes points out is that there is this neoliberal structure that many people are skeptical of, other people like, but at least amongst the critics, there's not much love for the neoliberal framework. And there's some empirical evidence on their side that will only increase the gap between the rich and the poor. And that is what seemed to happen, especially with Les Mis. As Les Mis got bigger and bigger and bigger, there was less and less there for all other productions. Okay, and so that is the first observation that Hughes makes about Les Mis. At the same time, and this is the second part of what we'll point out in this deep analysis, the show itself is about the plight of the poor, but it's more than that. It's about the identity of the poor. Earlier, I had said that simple accusations of hypocrisy were a little bit too simple. And at the end of Hughes' article, there's a lot of critical theory and a lot of critical theory jargon and many, many concepts. There are two that I take to be central, and they tend to confuse just about everyone the first time that you encounter them. And those two ideas are the social construction of reality and the discursive fight for identity. Okay, that's a mouthful when you say it all in one sentence, but I actually think both of those concepts are pretty simple, so I'm going to break those two down because they both play out kind of front and center in the narrative of Les Mis. Okay, so the first phrase there is the social construction of reality. That just means that society is shaped by human choices. And the proof is that different societies and cultures make different choices, and that shapes the way the society functions and what it values. If you believe that there's a king with the divine right to rule, you'll end up with a king. And if you stop believing that and want a republican government, you end up with something like the French Revolution. The important thing is that either is a choice, and there are a similar number of choices to be made about legal systems and fossil fuel consumption. Society is the sum total of human choices, so different choices can produce different societies, and if it seems to you impossible to challenge the current corporate structure we have in the United States or the theater system or the fossil fuel industry, just remember 200 years ago, it seemed impossible to believe that there would not be a king of France, but kind of the point of a revolution is that those things can change. So social construction of reality means that the way society is set up is the result of what human beings decide. And if we want to change society, we need to change the way we think. The second big idea in there is the discursive construction of identity. And that means that many inequities in society can be explained by the ways that different people are assigned different identities and what that means. If someone is called a felon or a prisoner, that means they are thought to have one set of characteristics. If they are thought of as a priest, they are thought to have another set of characteristics. If they're an immigrant or an undocumented immigrant, they are thought to have a certain set of characteristics and belong in a certain place of society. And one piece of evidence that identity construction is really at the heart of political arrangements is how hotly contested questions of identity are. Nothing right now is a bigger hot button issue than people who challenge traditional gender identities, like transgender people or gender fluid people or women who don't conform to traditional identities. Those are all a big bugaboo in the conservative circles. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying that you can tell identity is a big deal because it is those questions of identity that become the flashpoints for the most heated political debates that we're having in the United States right now. Immigrants are thought to have a very specific identity type, and making sure they're portrayed as either outsiders or unhealthy or criminal is central to some of the arch-conservative policies. Why would you chant build a wall if you thought of that an immigrant was somebody who's bringing economic value to your country and was probably somebody who had overcome oppression themselves and was ready to make a positive contribution? It is that question of identity that is central. Okay. So I'm not saying that it's even good or bad yet, but I am saying that social hierarchies are built around the way that different people have their identities defined, and that it is a social construction. So that the way we think of people and the way we think of certain identities is something that can change if enough people change their mind about it. So in the context of Les Mis, there's now, let's take all of those concepts. There's neoliberalism. We have a show like Les Mis that is participating in neoliberalism, and that happens against the context of a discursive construction of identity and a social construction of reality. There are 2 points I want to make here. The first is that this is absolutely the exact point that Victor Hugo is trying to make in his original novel. The problem with Les Miserables, the outsiders, the dispossessed, the low of the earth, is that they are thought of as lesser than, as immoral, as non-productive, as vile, as filth. Hugo's entire point is that thinking of these people in a different way transforms both them and society. When the priest treats Jean Valjean with kindness despite his criminality, it fundamentally changes who Jean Valjean is. It changes his identity, and he ends up not only being the mayor and a factory owner, but a good mayor and a good factory owner, a good boss. And then the second thing I'll say is just my own encounters with the unhoused. This is a central concern to them. I will not belabor the point, but I have done some research where the point of it was to go out and talk to a large number of unhoused people to see what would help them. I'm going to put the link to that final research report in the show notes if you're interested in finding more about that. But a common theme when we would go up and talk to an unhoused person, we were trying to say, hey, what services would help you? What do you think would really transform it? So many people that we talk to are acutely aware of how other people look at them, and they almost want respect more than they want money. That if somebody walks by and throws money at them and screams an insult, that is worse than not having the money. I think almost all of them would say, we don't want the money. If someone will just simply stop and have a conversation with them and treat them as a human being, that is a powerfully meaningful thing to the unhoused people that I have encountered. Now, I will say the unhoused population runs the gambit. There are definitely some of them that are mean. There are definitely some people in there who are criminal. There's some people who are so mentally disturbed that they aren't really somebody you could stop and have a conversation with. But There's also a large number of them who are, from a moral perspective, are just kind and gentle people that have found themselves without any money and without a place to live. And amongst that group, what they really want is respect more than money. Among the unhoused people that I've had the privilege of talking to, they definitely share with me that the way other people think about them, what it means to be unhoused, like their constant theme is treat me like a person, treat me like a human being. I'm not lesser than you are. That is a big question for them. And all that to me tells me that Victor Hugo was focusing his book on the identity of the people who were the most poor. And my experience with the most poor themselves, my observations looking at current politics are that the question of identity and what does it mean to be poor, what does it mean to be completely poor, destitute, or generationally poor is fundamental to the question of how can we help people? How can we solve that problem of poverty that Victor Hugo was saying we needed to really address 175 years ago? So in the end, Hughes poses this question. The musical production of Les Mis is one that participates in a neoliberal system of economics that socially constructs the identity of the poor in one very specific and very damaging way. But on the stage, it portrays an entirely different identity for poor people. The real question, the central question of the relationship between theater and poverty is one which is which one of those two things is more important? If you are participating in a system that will result in oppression and guarantees poverty, but you're doing so by putting forth an image that challenges the identity of what it means to be poor, which of those two is more important? And for Victor Hugo, this was a no-brainer. The real problem, according to Hugo, is the social construction of our society, and the heart of the matter is the way identities are constructed for the dispossessed. And changing that is the core of the matter. The problem was spiritual, and treating the least among us as holy and doing so in our politics was the way to address the problem. I know that's a mouthful and a lot of stuff, but that is ultimately the way Hugo's belief system fell together. He's writing a book about how to help the poor because he thinks that changing the way they are thought of is the most important thing. And he definitely thinks, as we have talked about in previous episodes, that literature can do that you can change the world by changing the way we look at the world, and that literature is a great way to do that. For me, I want to agree with that as much as I can, yet Hugo's novel is the most famous one in France, and there are still poor. And yet, Les Miserables is the most successful musical ever. It's shown to cheering audiences of more than 70 million, and yet there are still poor. I think that as we look back at Victor Hugo's proposition 175 years later, and having seen an enormous amount of critical theory to bolster his beliefs, we can say that there is evidence that neoliberalism, as an empirical fact, does increase economic inequality. But we can also say that discursively challenging the identities of the poor will be necessary, but not enough to end poverty. In slightly different terms, Hughes is right to say that mega musicals embrace neoliberalism, even as they critique the identity that it constructs, the identity of the poor that it constructs. I had posed this as a question before of which one is more important, but I think perhaps the answer is really that we need to do both. The question is it okay to write a musical about the problems of the poor while participating in a neoliberal system that makes you really wealthy? And I think the answer is it's good to say that you are presenting a positive identity for the unhoused people. But in the end, that's probably not enough. That identity has been out there. We have continued to push that. It has to be combined with some concrete action that will improve in material ways the lives of the poor. All right. I get that this has been a little heavy and not super focused on the musical, but I do think this is the core question at the heart of Les Mis, the ultimate book about the poor. It's what the question Victor Hugo wanted us to think about. And as we ask ourselves what lessons musical theater has for life, I think it is a question worth asking and worth engaging. I think it means that musical theater should recognize the way that it's complicit in economic models that guarantee exclusion. And to me, this includes preaching to our high school students the way performers need to accept the very rigidly hierarchical casting practices and the way mega musicals suck up all the oxygen to the exclusion of perhaps more innovative and more local theater. So, just as a summary, we hear almost always the same speech from the Tony winners every year. They always come out and it's, we took this 1 in a million shot, but we believed in ourselves and we believed in the script and we believed in each other and it worked out. And this award is a validation We have heard that, and that is a valid way of approaching theater. But what we are missing is the experience of the losers. And we have a system that guarantees far more losers than winners. And what Victor Hugo wanted us to think about is don't start your evaluation of society by looking at the people for whom it works the best and those who are most successful. Think about those for whom it works the least well and have the least amount of success. And I think the lesson for theater is, instead of focusing only on the story of the 1 in a million shot that made it big and knocked them dead on Broadway, we think about all the people who did not get that far and all the projects that crashed and burned and the people who keep trying and never get cast for anything. If we think about that, we can probably come up with a better way of doing theater. And theater can be the truly empowering possibility that can change lives. So focus on the losers. Yes, the losers. Well, that makes an excellent transition to the second main thing we're going to talk about today. Where did the show fail? It was a loser in France. Why did this show not succeed in France? Let's start with 3 things I'm not afraid to call facts. I'm going to add another one at the end. The first one is Hugo wrote Les Mis as a statement about French character, and the book's success in France is due in large part because of that. It is a book about the revolution, but it's also a treatise on the soul of France. He wants to know what is the real France, and he thinks for sure Louis Napoleon is distorting what it truly means to be French, and he wants to recapture that. He wants to recapture that in this novel. Boublil switched his creative project from the revolution to Les Mis for the very same reason, to make it more French and about more than just the revolution. So that dude already had a play about the revolution. He made it into Les Mis so that he could make a musical that would resonate in France. That's the second fact. The third fact is, despite both of those 2 things, the only losing version of the production was the one that ran in Paris. And the thing that I will tack on to the end of that, the new one, is the 2012 movie by director Toby Hooper and produced by Cameron Mackintosh himself, won 3 Oscars and made $442 million, but flopped in France. And that presents the gaping and obvious question: why does the musical make it everywhere except for France when ultimately it is a statement about French culture? Okay, so for help, I'm going to turn to Sarvarna Variyar, who is a postgraduate student in the Studies of Religion department at the University of Sydney. In 2012, he published an article in a journal called Literature and Aesthetics. And Variyar very much agrees with my description of what Les Mis means to France. I'm going to read you a quote. I'm going to finish this quote in just a little bit. Hugo's original Les Miserables, written during and for the emerging modern French nation, is perhaps the most prominent post-revolutionary work of fiction focusing on the new French identity. And that, I do think, is what Hugo was trying to do. Why did he not center it on one particular revolution? He was focusing on France, which was in almost a constant state of revolution. And he was trying to figure out, what does it mean to be French? What should France become? And Les Miserables is as much a statement about that as it is about anything. For Variyar, the answer in Les Mis is that there's a transcendent, religiously oriented French nationalism articulated in the book. It's a civic religion. That is, it's a nation brought together by a shared spiritual commitment to each other that is not traditional Christianity. Whereas, say, in the United States, the evangelical movement says that the nation should embrace Christianity for its political decision-making. Hugo would say France itself should be formed around a shared understanding of a spiritual commitment to one another that transcended any religion. So for the evangelicals, the equation is that politics should follow our religion. And for Hugo, the answer is that religion should found the politics of France, should define who we are as a nation. It's not that there's a separate spiritual world and then our nation will rise or fall depending on how well we follow the one true church. It is that we should see our spiritual connection to one another and embody that in all of the civic and political decisions that we're making. This, thought Hugo, would reshape the identities of the poor in a way that solved the problem of their disempowerment. Les Mis, the novel, is epic because it encompasses the totality of the human struggle. The meaning is in its language and it's in the digressions, and it is not simply located in the plot. Think about it. If you were to read the Bible, is it a page-turning, great plot-driven novel? You can find stories in there for sure, and you can superimpose the story arc, but a lot of it is not that. And what Variyar thinks is that's kind of what Hugo's intentionally doing with Les Mis. There is a plot in there and you can follow it, but that's not all that is in the book, and it's not even the main part of the book. The plot can highlight different elements of spirituality, but it is spirituality at the core. Javert and the church represent narrow, legalistic, and hierarchical ways of relating to each other. Jean Valjean and the priest treat each other well, not because of the consequences of being punished if you break the rules, but because acts of unrequited kindness bind us to each other humans as spiritual beings. Society should be organized around connections to each other because of our shared inherent worth as spiritual beings and not as self-interested egos that are constantly in competition with each other that need to be restrained by a system of laws. If you think the conflict between Javert and Jean Valjean is the center of the Les Mis story, then that is kind of the conclusion that you have to come up with, that we need to have Jean Valjean is a hero precisely because he's transformed by the priest's act of kindness. Then he spends the rest of his time trying to help other people around him, including the lowest among us. And Javert is the villain precisely because he's focusing on narrow legalistic interpretations. Anyway, says Barrière, that's what the book is about. And there's a point to be made there. Hugo to the end defended Les Mis as a deeply spiritual book, and it was all about how France should be reformulated amidst its ongoing series of revolutions. And in ways I appreciate, Barrière thinks the 1980 concept rock album captures the true vibe of the original book, but the orchestrated, string-oriented 1984 score does not, and he's right that the 1980 album did well in France, but the 1991 Paris production and the 2012 movie face-planted in France. I think that maybe he's reading a little too much into the 1980 concept rock album truly capturing the French, but there's no doubt that once it got to be a mega musical and produced in a way that sounded like all the other mega musicals, even though it was sort of setting the standard for what a mega musical should sound like, that version of the show did not go well in France. And there's kind of a reason for that. If you're going to dramatize something like Les Mis, you have to focus on the plot. You're not going to put together an entire 1,500-page book, even if you're a BBC show, and capture all of it. You've got to make some cuts. And some of those are easy, like the digressions on sewage, on criminal slang, recounting the Battle of Waterloo. Those are things that if you're trying to cut it down to a show that is under 2 hours that will keep an audience engaged, you're going to get rid of that, and you're going to focus on the universal themes. Everyone, including Barrière, thinks that works. Here's another quick quote from Barrière, quote, "The result is a visually and orally compelling product, but one which seems to represent Hugo's underlying themes as though they are no longer relevant," end quote. It works as a musical. The question is, what happens to the underlying theme? So I will now return to that first quote of Barrière's I read because I think it answers the question about why the musical works everywhere but France. Quote, "If Hugo's original Les Miserables, written during and for the emerging modern French nation, is perhaps the most prominent post-revolutionary work of fiction, focusing on the new French identity," and that's what I have read you so far, here's how the sentence ends, "then its English language musical adaptation, particularly when considered in contrast with its 1980 predecessor, highlights exactly what that identity is not," end quote. Now, like I said before, I'm less sure that Barrière is that 1980s concept rock album captures the true spirit of France. It is, after all, co-written by a guy from England who worked with a soul funk group, Hot Chocolate, who helped produce these lyrics, quote, "When I'm close to you, I want to touch you. There are people everywhere, people who like to stare. Can't take it, baby. Let's get out of here. Heaven's in the back seat of my Cadillac," end quote. Just ask yourself, is the guy responsible for producing that really the guy who had his finger on the true soul, the heartbeat of the true soul of France? Maybe that's a stretch. But even if Barrière is a little bit off about the 1980 album, I do think that the article overall contains an answer to her core question. The musical fails in France because it is anglicized. And it's got a universalized vision that focuses on the plot. And it fails to deliver what every French person already knows, that Les Mis contains an idyllic vision of what the heart of France is. So to make it work internationally, you take the universal themes, you focus on the plot, and you strip out the rest, which is a deep discussion of what it means to be French. But if you're French, you have probably already read Les Mis, or you've been exposed to it at some point. You know that the idyllic vision of France is in there, and you've probably thought about it if you don't accept it. And when you see that musical version, you can see all of that has been stripped away. And that will do it for our final dive into the musical Les Mis. It's a great show. If you're not looking for the true meaning of the French spirit, it's got a great message about how society keeps its poor down by forcing identities on them that are almost impossible to overcome and insisting that constantly resisting them and by constantly pushing back, we can make some progress. That is what happens. End scene of Les Mis. But it is my feeling that probably won't get us there as long as the musicals are running through the exact same economic systems that are creating the problems of poverty in the first place. Victor Hugo, you had a vision about how to unite poetry, spirituality, and politics, and you are invited to my seances anytime I get around to holding them. The Casting of Pod is not sponsored by Hasbro, but if you want to summon the spirit of Victor Hugo, they hold the patent on the Ouija board and will be happy to sell you an alphabet board and a planchet. If you get him on the line, make sure you ask him what he thinks about the musical. In fact, if you hold a seance and summon Victor Hugo and you ask him about the musical, drop me a note and by God, I will put it on the show. We will lay to rest Les Mis here and we will step away from France, but we will not run out of musical theater productions to talk about anytime soon. Up next is Cats, whose immediate mysteries might not seem that deep. Why did T.S. Eliot like Cats so much? And why I like Cats so much is the same thing. Why didn't he capitalize words? That's a little weird. How can you make an unlimited budget movie that includes Taylor Swift and still not get an audience? Did the costumes that used in the Cats production really get made out of yak hair? I am hereby granting you an invitation to the Jellicle Ball, and our next episode will broadcast live from the Heaviside Lair on the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.